Hi, everyone. Today we're going to take a look at the conditions that lead up to the start of World War II and how they're really based in policies of European countries prior to all of the aggressive acts that come later. We're going to look at Hitler's actions and the reactions of especially Great Britain and France and how they dealt with Hitler, and try to consider any possibilities of a way to stop Hitler before he really gets going. This timeline in your textbook is really invaluable. I'd recommend you take a peek at that. It really does a nice job of kind of laying out the origins of World War II. January 1933, we talked already about Hitler becoming chancellor. And then in October of 33, Germany withdraws from the League of Nations. And so Hitler's kind of testing the waters here, kind of feeling things out. What can he get away with? 35, Hitler is going to announce the remilitarization of Germany, both in the form of naval and air power. Later on, Hitler is going to announce conscription, so that's draft, to make sure that his army is built up, taking it from 100,000 to about 500,000. We see the Anglo-German Naval Pact, which I'll get into later. Mussolini is going to invade Ethiopia, trying to right a wrong from way back in imperialism, where Ethiopia hit the Italians pretty hard, and it was a huge embarrassment as Italy tried to become an imperialist nation. Then Hitler is going to occupy the Rhineland, which we'll get into a little bit later on too. Mussolini and Hitler are going to intervene in Spain. We talked about Guernica and Pablo Picasso and how the ideas of what will eventually become known as the Blitzkrieg are going to be tested out in the Spanish Civil War, along with Generalissimo Francisco Franco. And then in October of 1936, we see the Rome-Berlin axis, and that's kind of where we're going to leave off with this origin story. We're going to get into right now just a little bit of Lebensraum, that concept of living space that Hitler is going to promote in Mein Kampf. Okay, so this concept of Lebensraum, living space, Hitler's specifically talking about to the east in Russia. He believes that with the Russian Civil War that happens, getting rid of Tsar Nicholas II, who again has ties to Kaiser Wilhelm. This is a Germanic man. He's got relationships with all of the different leaders across Europe. Well, now it's become a communist movement, that Bolshevik revolution. And so he no longer believes that this group has the ability to lead. And so he thinks that they're kind of ripe for the picking at this point. He wants to eliminate the Slavs as a power and turn them basically into second-class citizens, that he's going to use them for slave labor in order to rebuild what he thinks is the true Russia, or excuse me, what is the true Germany, and kind of create this empire. So he's going to basically just use them in order to build everything else up. Believes that, like a lot of different things, the Slavs are the downfall of humanity. He's going to say that quite a few times. But what eventually is going to force his hand is an impatience. Your textbook gets into a little bit about his health. He's nervous about not having the opportunity to kind of finish the job. And that's going to hurt him because, oh, guess what? You shouldn't attack Russia in the wintertime. Surprise, surprise. The European nations are going to deal with this with a policy called appeasement. And my definition is kind of the policy of European leaders to give Hitler a little in hope of keeping Europe out of another war. They're more concerned about keeping Europe out of another war than they are with Hitler's particular power in this case. And we're going to see this come up in a few different ways here. The Treaty of Versailles limited Germany to 100,000 troops, no air power, no air force, and a very, very limited navy. They also declared the Rhineland, as you see on the map there, a DMZ, a demilitarized zone. No military is allowed to occupy that. That gives France the opportunity, if Germany is kind of throwing away the ideas of the Treaty of Versailles, to come in and completely take over. That's kind of what they did during the Great Depression, when Germany refused to pay, at least initially in 1923. That's an area that's highly industrialized, and so it's really what's going to run the German economy. And if that goes away for Germany, Germany's going to be in some real trouble. So Hitler's plan is really going to take a look at a couple of things. He wants to domestically show the German people that he's strong enough and that the German people are proud, and give them something to blame. And in looking at the Treaty of Versailles, to be able to say that these parts are unfair and we need to change those. And so he presents it to the other European leaders as not a power grab, but instead simply looking at how can we change these things to bring Germany back to prominence. He also wants to make sure that he keeps France from acting out, because while the French are, the French, he knows that Germany is extremely weakened at this point, and he knows that if France can come in and kind of organize some collective military action, that Germany is really going to be in trouble, especially early on in the mid-1930s. And then finally, he's just going to kind of take what's given to him. He's willing to kind of negotiate a little bit in order to get what he wants, in order to keep moving Germany forward. He's not super concerned with how he looks to the people of Germany in terms of kind of being wishy-washy. He wants to make sure that the European leaders feel a sense of comfort. He thinks that the European leaders will, in some cases, be so ready to put off war that they're going to give him some small concessions along the way. And he just wants to kind of test the waters like you do with teachers or parents, kind of testing where that line is. And so that's going to be Hitler's motivations in the next few slides here. We're going to see where Hitler goes from here. He starts to chip away at everything. He withdraws from the Geneva Disarmament Conference and the League of Nations in October of 33, shortly after being named chancellor. And this is going to lead to further action because Britain and France say, oh, well, he's just doing that to curry favor with the German people. And that's kind of his intent with all this. But again, it's a testing ground for him to see how these other countries react. In March 1935, he begins to rearm Germany. And the other countries say, well, he's just kind of defending his homeland. And then the Anglo-German Naval Pact happens in 1935, 36. And this is a complete shock, really. Basically, Britain says you can have a navy, but it has to be no more than 35% of the British Navy, which obviously is the biggest in the world at this time. So it's still a considerable force. The whole goal in all of this is because the Western countries, the Western European nations, are nervous about how the USSR is becoming a power. And so they don't want to see that happen. And that's kind of why Britain makes this concession. Neville Chamberlain is the prime minister at this time in Britain, and he is the one driving this idea of appeasement forward. And the rest of there are pieces of British Parliament led by Winston Churchill, as you see in this quote here, which are in complete disagreement of this. March 7th, 1976, he's going to enter into that demilitarized zone in the Rhineland, and at this point he knows that the other countries are not going to step in, and that he kind of has free rein to do as he sees fit. And so this is where we start to see him make his way into other nations. Austria, his homeland, his birthplace. He basically threatens Austria into giving up. He says, unless you admit some Nazis into your parliament, you're not going to exist anymore. And so Austria allows appoints these Nazi leaders into their birthright, into their parliament. And that's basically just going to give them the ability to say, Hitler, take over Austria. And that's exactly what he does. In Czechoslovakia, which had been the only post-World War I democracy in Eastern Europe left standing, we have an area called the Sudetenland, and there are quite a bit of ethnic Germans living in that region. The highly industrialized, highly sought-after region for Czechoslovakia. And in September 29th, 1938, the Munich Conference is going to happen. The Czechs and the Russians are not invited to this. Neville Chamberlain basically gives Hitler the Sudetenland. Hitler says, we get this, I promise you, we're done expanding. He's holding his two fingers crossed behind his back. And Neville Chamberlain says that this will ensure peace in our time, and he celebrates this as a huge thing. And for Hitler, this is confirmation bias. This is showing him that even in an act of aggression, the other European nations are not going to step in. They're not going to stop him. March 15th, 1939, he marches into Czechoslovakia, taking over. At this point, Czechoslovakia is effectively neutered, really does not have any power, and they know that they're not going to get backing from the rest of these Western European nations. And that's kind of that. Finally, we get to Poland, and this is really what most people look at as the beginning of World War I. Finally, the British and the French basically say, enough is enough. Meanwhile, they've waited 3 years to do this, and in their efforts to try and avoid war, they've actually hastened the advent and the harbingers of war. Soviet non-aggression pact with Hitler and the Soviet Union is signed on August 23rd of 1939, and this gives him the ability to not have to worry about fighting a two-front war like Germany had to in World War I. This is a huge deal for them, and the fact that they get there first, it has to do with how those Western European nations are really, really frightened of communism. And so they view communism as the bigger threat as opposed to the fascist dictatorships of Hitler and Mussolini. September 1st, 1939, they plan for and begin this invasion. 2 days later, Britain and France declare war. A couple of weeks after that, the Soviet Union invades Poland from the other side. And this is basically the beginning of World War I. This is September 1st, 1939, is what most people look at because this is the first true fighting, true act of aggression beyond just the policies of appeasement that lead us there. Your textbook does a great job of kind of painting this picture of how frustrating it is for us to look back as historians and see the steps that led to Hitler's dominance there. It's just a really frustrating time period in European politics. If you have any questions, please feel free to let me know. When you're finished watching this video, please make sure that you start working on your notes for chapter 27. Again, the quiz is going to be next Friday, not this Friday, but next Friday. Have a great day.